Okay. Good morning, everybody. I hope that everybody is healthy and that you all had a restful and meaningful Memorial Day weekend. I am Michael Eisenstadt, Kahn Fellow and Director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for News Policy. Today's event is about Iran's naval forces, a particularly timely event in light of recent developments in the Gulf and the role that the Navy has played, or Iran's naval forces have played in the last year as part of Iran's counter-pressure campaign. To discuss this topic, we have three excellent speakers, and I will announce them in the order, or I will introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking. First, we have Michael Connell, who is a senior scientific analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. He is director of its Iranian Studies Program and a former CNA field representative to the U.S. NAVCENT headquarters in Bahrain. His published works include studies of Iranian military doctrine and strategy, and they've been published in places such as USIP's Iran Primer, and you can find some of his CNA studies online. He did a particularly good study on lessons from the Iran-Iraq War for Iran. The second speaker today is Farzin Nadimi, who is an associate fellow with the Washington Institute, who specializes in the security and defense affairs of Iran and the Gulf region. Farzin is a native Farsi speaker, and he holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Manchester. His latest publication, and in a way, this is kind of the reason we're holding this event, is his latest publication is Iran's Evolving Approach to Asymmetric Naval Warfare. This publication was released just a few weeks ago by the Washington Institute. It updates an earlier publication he did over a decade ago on this topic. About 75 pages long, has all kinds of information about the geopolitical and geostrategic environment in the Gulf, Iran's naval order of battle, IRGC Navy, regular Navy, has extensive tables describing Iran's naval exercises and some very, very attractive graphics. So thank you, Maria, for those. And our third speaker today is Vice Admiral John Miller. Vice Admiral Miller is a retired Vice Admiral in the U.S. Navy. He most recently served as commander of the 5th Fleet in Bahrain and head of NAVCENT, which is the naval component of CENTCOM in the Central region in the Middle East. Currently, he is president of the Fawzi Miller Group and an associate fellow with the International Institute for Strategic Studies, as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I've also recently read some of his works, including a very nice piece he had with Atlantic Council on kind of rules of engagement in the Gulf and some of the president's recent tweets and whether that affects how we operate there. So Mike will be talking first about Iranian strategy and how the Navy fits into this. Farzin's going to talk to us about how Iran's naval forces have evolved in their capabilities in the last 3 or 4 decades. And then Vice Admiral Miller is going to provide us some perspective based on his time in the region as NAVCENT commander and his experiences interacting with the Iranian Navy, Iranian naval forces, I should say. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate here today. Let me just say to the audience that you can start sending in questions to the speakers by email. Send them to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. Again, that is policyforum, that is one word, at washingtoninstitute.org. So anyhow, with no further ado, we're going to start off, and I'll ask Mike, can you start with your presentation, and we'll go down the line, and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions afterwards. So Mike, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Mike. I wanted to thank both you and Farzin for putting on this event, by the way, and the Washington Institute, because I think the topic is a very timely one. I think it's funny that despite the shift in focus to great power competition, we keep getting pulled back to Iran. It's the gift that keeps on giving, I guess. That issue's not going away. It's been repeated ad nauseum by people who watch events in the Gulf that the potential for escalation between Iran and the United States there is a potential there, and that potential is very real. It's a problem, and I think recent events have highlighted this in particular. Of course, hostile interactions between the U.S. and Iran in the Persian Gulf is not new. Prior to the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA, there was a statement by the NAVCENT public affairs officer that basically stated that they were having about 2.5 hostile or unprofessional and problematic interactions a month. So in that sense, these problems have been there in the past. This isn't something new. And the event last month is probably only distinguishable for the size of the interaction rather than the nature of it. There were a lot of vessels involved in that interaction. But the difference is now these interactions are taking place against the backdrop of the maximum pressure campaign, the Soleimani killing, the attacks on U.S. troops in Iraq, the attacks on third-party shipping in the Gulf, and the attacks on Gulfi infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure. And finally, also the Houthi issue I think, plays a role in this as well. And we have to account for what's happening down in the Bab el-Mandeb. So against all of these events and things going on, there really is a higher potential, I think, for escalation and miscalculation. The Navy, the U.S. Navy recently issued a notice to mariners basically saying that any vessels that close within 100 meters of U.S. vessels would be subject to lawful defensive measures. And most people see this as perhaps an escalatory statement. I don't. I actually think it's going to reduce the potential for miscalculation. It's been very clearly stated. It's not clear that the Iranians will abide by this, but it's certainly been, I think it'll alleviate some of the potential for miscalculation. I think most Gulf watchers believe that the Iranians aren't seeking a conflict in the Gulf, and neither is the United States. In fact, the Supreme Leader made a public statement to this effect a few months ago, and he said, they don't want war, we don't want war. But yet all these events keep happening. So why is it? Well, first it's the steady state issues, I would call them, the events that preceded the maximum pressure campaign. So Iran has often used its naval forces as a tool of coercion to apply pressure on the United States, its coalition partners, and its Gulf allies during periods of heightened tension. There's a wedge-driving aspect to this, too, that I think bears some further exploration. There's also a deterrent aspect. There's a defensive component to what Iran's doing. Iran certainly sees its naval forces as a deterrent to its perceived adversaries. And finally, there's a legal aspect, too. And I think Farzine's publication really lays this out well. And it's one of the few places I've seen it done this thoroughly, which is of the different legal interpretations of Iran's territorial waters, of the right of innocent passage, et cetera, et cetera. And I highly recommend people who are watching this to read his publication for that. But there are some new details, too. So these are the steady state issues. The new issues on the maximum pressure campaign, I noticed there was an uptick in official rhetoric coming out of Iran after the waivers for third parties to import Iranian oil. Those waivers were denied by Department of Treasury. Official rhetoric coming out of Iran really began to focus on the unfairness of the situation and the fact that Iran wouldn't stand by and let other countries ship oil from the Gulf when they were under such pressure to denying them the ability to ship oil from the Gulf. So this was across the Iranian political spectrum. Officials from all different sides basically said that Iran wasn't going to allow shipments from the Gulf. IRGC members were very blunt on this. Basically, the former IRGC commander, Ali Jafari, basically said, we're ready to teach the enemy what it means when we say that either everyone is entitled to use the Strait of Hormuz or no one is. That was par for the course. But you even had President Rouhani coming out and cryptically basically saying the same thing. So this really showed me that at this point, Iran was going to push the envelope in the Gulf and become a little more aggressive about asserting its rights and applying pressure on the U.S. and its partners and allies. It's no accident, by the way, that many of the targets that the Iranians have chosen in the Gulf are energy related. This has been a consistent. If you look at all the incidents over the previous months, whether it's the attacks on Gulfi infrastructure, whether it's the attacks on the tankers, there's always an energy component to it, and I think that's significant. In this regard, I'd say geography has been kind to the Iranians. It's been stated in other places, but the Strait of Hormuz is significant to the world's energy supplies. It accounts for, it's really the jugular, I guess you could say, of world energy supplies. It accounts for approximately 1/3 of all the oil shipped in the world. And I'll skip over this quickly because I think Farzine's, again, I refer you to Farzine's monograph because I think it covers this in more detail. But basically, a lot of Iran's naval strategy has focused on this component, on Iran's ability to close or interfere with shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Geography is also significant from an operational perspective if you're talking naval operations. The Gulf is constrained. It's a tiny body of water. It's at its widest point, it's only about 200 kilometers wide, 200 nautical miles wide. A lot of critical U.S. military infrastructure is inside the Gulf. You've got NAVCENT, the CENTCOM's forward naval headquarters. You've got the KAOK at Al Udeid in Qatar. And these are only about, you're talking a couple hundred miles from the Iranian coastline. The Gulf's confined environment favors the offense over the defense. So there isn't a lot of time to react. If you're a coalition vessel going through the Strait of Hormuz or you're inside the Gulf and vessels are closing in on you, there isn't a lot of time to sit back, assess the situation, and react. It's all very quick and there's very limited timelines, particularly because Iran's invested in a lot of coastal defense cruise missiles. So Iranian coastal defense cruise missiles pepper the Gulf. They're located in the islands in the Gulf. Something that a lot of people, I think, forget is that Iran owns a lot of property in the water in the Gulf in the form of these islands, like Abu Musa, the Tums, Farsi, etc. And these also provide Iran with a tactical advantage in that regard. The Gulf is heavily trafficked. There's a lot of shipping in the Gulf. Anybody who visits the Gulf, you can look out, the window of your hotel if you face the Gulf on an average day, and you will see tankers coming in and out. You'll see dhows going in and out. You'll see all sorts of bulk carriers. It's heavily trafficked. And Iran's naval forces could certainly exploit the high density of this shipping to mask their operations, engage in hit and run operations, etc. And finally, the terrain on the northern side of the Gulf tends to be very rocky. There are a lot of inlets, and I think this plays to Iran's advantages because Iran, the tactics employed by the IRGC Navy are very much like the tactics employed by guerrillas, essentially. It's like a guerrilla organization at sea. They use small unit ambushes, hit and run operations, these types of things. And I think the terrain very much favors that. So these factors, I think, they mitigate some of the shortfalls that Iran's naval forces have, which, they're not 10 feet tall. They do have serious shortfalls. Sustainment, ISR, they lack aircraft for reconnaissance and for strike. So they have serious shortfalls, and I think the terrain, to a certain extent, mitigates some of those problems for them. Now, the U.S. naval forces, of course, don't have to operate inside the Gulf. They can operate from outside the Gulf. But there are also serious political and military drawbacks associated with that as well. It's a trade-off. It's not a simple calculation of, well, just move them outside the Gulf. And another factor for consideration is that Iran's been extending its reach outside the Gulf as well. So I think Farzine will talk more about the capabilities, but they've been certainly extending the range on their short-range ballistic missiles, the accuracy. So now they can be used for military targeting. Their UAVs they've been improving the range on those. We've seen with the attacks by the Houthis on Saudi infrastructure and by the Iranians on Saudi infrastructure. So Iran has been pushing the envelope further and further away from the Gulf. This brings me to another point, actually, about Iran's. I'll wrap up because I think I got to make this pretty quick. It brings me another point about Iran's strategy, which is if I had to sum up their maritime strategy in one phrase, it would be make do with less. The Iranians have been very good about investing in capabilities that play to their strengths and are designed to target U.S. and partner and coalition weaknesses. So, for instance, and a lot of the things they do are very low cost too. So they've invested in mines. Counter mine warfare is something that most navies don't do well. We try to do the best we can with it, but it's a very difficult task, and it requires a lot of investment to do mine countermeasures. But mines are relatively cheap in comparison, and the Iranians have invested, according to a public ONI assessment, they have thousands of mines in their inventory at this point. The Iranians have been investing in coastal defense cruise missiles. They've been investing in small to medium-sized submarines. They've been building their own submarines, by the way, so they have a big emphasis on self-sufficiency. Two other points, just in passing, I'll make about Iranian strategy and doctrine. There's a decentralization aspect to this. So back in the 2007, 2008, the Iranians moved to, it's called a mosaic defense, and they moved some of the C2 components of their strategy away from central control, and they delegated a lot of authority to lower echelon commanders. This could potentially have an implication for escalation in the Gulf. And another aspect that I think that bears watching is that the IRGC Navy particularly tends to reward aggressive, forward-leaning commanders. If you look at who they promote and why they promote them, the commanders who get ahead tend to be ones who take chances and take risks. And I think that has a potential for that could add to the potential for miscalculation in the Gulf as well. I've probably gone over time, so I will yield the floor at this point.
Okay, Farzin?
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate your kind words about my report, and also really appreciate Vice Admiral Miller and you, Dr. Connell, for participating in this event. When we want to talk about Iran's naval capability, it is indeed a tale of two navies. One with an established professional basis going back several decades, from the port of Khorramshahr in the north to the port of Chabahar to the southeast, with an eye on the blue waters and the strategic missions. And one with a short yet feisty history. They both have made progress since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, with more emphasis placed on naval power as a means of controlling shipping lanes in and out of the Persian Gulf to protect their economic interests, to support their revolutionary values and ideas, and to conduct psychological operations. In 2009, Iran's supreme leader added the prefix strategic to the national navy's title, and gave it a mission to maintain a presence in open waters even beyond the Strait of Bab el-Mandab and the 10th parallel north. He saw a threat from the direction of the sea and called for increasing deterrence at sea. This expanded rule put a huge burden on the dwindling fleet and prompting the Navy to initiate a series of projects to build warships domestically. So the Iranian Navy today is relatively modern with an indigenous industrial base, which gives it some room to expand. But the command and control leaves much to be desired, and as we saw in the most recent accident off the coast of Iran in the Oman. So while retaining some good strike capabilities, such as kilo-class submarines and midget submarines, with now the capability to deploy anti-ship missiles and naval mines, in addition to shore-based missile batteries, it is best suited for what it is more often doing, maintaining Iran's lines of communications into the Arabian Sea and the Gulf of Aden, And it is better to stay that way. So the post-Iran-Iraq War milestones for the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, or the national navies, if I want to sum up, are delivery of the first Kilo class submarine in 1991. That helped establish the submarine force and help Iran enter an era of subsurface warfare. And then they started to, as Mike mentioned, then they started to develop their own, both medium submarine, larger and medium class submarine. And they have ambitions to design even larger submarines for operations further along. Commissioning of the first home-built warship, a Sina class fast attack boat, in 2003. Then the frigate class, Moj class warships, Jamaran was commissioned in 2010. That was a copy of the British design already in Iranian service. The third Moj frigate, Sahand, was commissioned in 2018, and it incorporates more advanced systems and radars and ESM intelligence collection equipment. The next milestone was the separation of operational areas of responsibility for both national and revolutionary navies. So the National Navy could now focus on its main area of operation, expanding from the Gulf of Oman into the 10 parallel north, and the Revolutionary Navy on the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. And by doing so, coming of the so-called strategic era for the Navy, after the Supreme Leader called on the Navy to go strategic, and become a truly strategic military force. He even has ambitions for a global naval presence, which seem to be really far-fetched at the moment. So needless to say, the Navy does not have the capability to sustain such missions beyond the 10 parallel north, and while maintaining ambitious mission of sending its Navy units, and it has this trying to expand its industrial base by developing warships with 4,000 to 7,000 ton and submarines in the 3,000 ton class, displacement class. So if this leap from the existing 1,500 ton to 4,000 and then 7,000 ton for warships, and from 600 to 3,000 ton for submarines, just ignoring the Kilo class. It is in fact happening, and they have been investing resources into designing these ships, even though slowly. It suggests we might see more frequent long-range naval expeditions in the future. But can it be translated into a flourishing Navy and first-class naval facilities on the Gulf of Oman coastline? It is unlikely. The ambitions are there, the pressure from the clerics is there, but the budget, it is not there. And now turning to the Revolutionary Navy. Now, the Revolutionary Navy was born out of a necessity back in 1985. First, to conduct amphibious operations in the Iraqi marshlands in support of the Iranian offensive operations during the Iran-Iraq War. But with the start of the second phase, the so-called second phase of the tanker war, which is the Kuwaiti reflagging operation from early 1987, the IRGC Navy shifted its attention to the Persian Gulf and started harassing and attacking oil tankers, especially those carrying Kuwaiti and crude oil. So needless to say, the original decision by Iran to retaliate against Gulf shipping was a bad idea, which put Iran's actions on the fringes of legality and pushed Iran and the region further into conflict, while it never stopped Iraq from attacking Iranian tankers or its oil facilities. I believe it was a major miscalculation, which also further dragged in the Western naval forces, and we know the rest. So despite claims by the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard presence in the Gulf never served Iran's grand strategy and its national interests. Interestingly, it still doesn't. Had it not been for the Revolutionary Guard Navy and its perhaps the Western navies didn't need to maintain such a military presence. The IRGC Navy today consists of over 20 bases, from the Shatt al-Arab to the to Pakistani border. And they have gone a long way from the days they were operating Chinese Silkworm missiles and home-built fiberglass boats. They have now missiles developed locally, some with the help of the Chinese, and they can be carried on light to medium speedboats with ranges between 25 kilometers and 300 kilometers. Some with different means of guidance. So, factoring in the speed of such boats, they can effectively cover the entire Gulf region if they can deploy safely. Compared to the ragtag group of inexperienced sailors back in the 80s, they have now developed significant special operations capabilities as well, and now we saw how they did and how it worked last summer when they used limpet mines to disable shipping in the region. So, what were the post-Iran-Iraq War milestones for the Revolutionary Navy? It was introduction of the cruise missiles, C-802 or Noor cruise missiles, the very versatile coastal batteries in early 1990s, introducing North Korean Hodong missile boats in 1997 were the next milestones, and it continued into 2007 when the IRGC Navy and the National Navy again completed the division of areas of responsibility, and that followed by moving the headquarters of the Revolutionary Navy from Tehran to Bandar Abbas in 2010. And then in 2004, IRGC Navy tested their famous Squall torpedo rockets. That was considered another milestone, and followed by the introduction of Khalija Fars, which was the first ballistic anti-ship missiles in the region that was employed, precision guided with optical guidance, employed by the IRGC in 2004 and tested the year after. That is believed by the IRGC to be a game changer. They believe that has stopped the U.S. carriers from frequently crossing the Strait of Hormuz. So, even though not much is known about the IRGC Navy's modern sensor-equipped naval mines and underwater shallow water IEDs, it can be expected they have made significant investment in that areas in those access denial that fits their access denial. Also, details are lacking about the IRGC Navy's renewed interest in submarine warfare, most likely midget submarines. And they have also expanded their unmanned explosive boat capabilities, not to mention their aerial UAVs for both surveillance and also attack. And so they base their explosive boats, drone boats, all around the Persian Gulf region, but mostly near the Strait of Hormuz in the tunnels that they have dug in, including one south of Resh Island, just overlooking the Strait of Hormuz. They are used to hide boats and drone boats, to launch them directly into the shipping lanes. So to wrap up, with the maximum pressure campaign continuing, Tehran could be expected to put an increasingly aggressive stance toward the United States. And with the occasional tactical freelancing we have been witnessing, as Mike mentioned, which allows aggressive young commanders earn fame and promotion by taking risky steps around U.S. vessels, there will continue to be a significant risk of misinterpretation and escalation in the Persian Gulf region.
Thank you, Farzin. Vice Admiral Miller.
Thanks, Mike, for allowing me to participate. Thanks to the Washington Institute as well. It's really an honor to be part of such a distinguished panel and on a subject that's so important. So we just heard two really excellent presentations that discussed the Iranian maritime strategy and some of the capability gains that Iran has made over the past couple of decades. And as you've heard, the Iranians have done a pretty impressive job, despite the fact that they've been under some pretty harsh sanctions really since the beginning of the regime. They've been able to build both a conventional and an asymmetric capability that allows them to carry out their strategy and to do so relatively effectively. So it's an impressive effort that should not be lost on us. So my task this morning is to discuss how Iran has put that strategy into action. What does it really mean on the waterfront? And what activities have they undertaken so that they can influence the maritime domain? And given the strategic importance of the region, which we've already talked about, the consequences of their maritime activity not only affect the region, but they have consequences that impact the entire global economy. So what they do is important. The reference document for most of my comments comes from Farzin's excellent study regarding Iran's evolving approach to asymmetric warfare. So let me be the third person in this presentation today to recommend you read it if you haven't had a chance to read it, and keep a copy with you because it's really a terrific piece of work. When I look around the globe, there are 6 major maritime choke points. There's more than that, obviously, but there's 6 of them that really impact the global flow of commerce. And 3 of those choke points, the Suez Canal, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the BAM, and the Strait of Hormuz, all fall within the Central Command area of responsibility. 2 of those, the BAM and the Strait of Hormuz, I would suggest are under persistent threat by Iran, either directly or through the use of one of their proxies. In particular, it's the Houthis in Yemen that are impacting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in a negative way. Those are the only 2 major choke points that are under stress anywhere in the world, and Iran has, over the last couple of decades, I think, done a pretty decent job in developing capability that's designed to pressure, in particular, the Strait of Hormuz, and to do so pretty much when they desire to do so. In order to highlight an important point, the conduct of shipping through both straits is, and I think maybe Michael and I disagree a little bit here, Michael Connell, the conduct of shipping through those straits is governed by international treaty and conventions, specifically the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the call regs, or the rules of the road, if you will, and then the rules regarding the safety of life at sea. And so, despite all of the bellicose rhetoric that we hear out of the Iranians regarding their ownership of the Strait of Hormuz, they don't have any specific claim to the Strait of Hormuz. They don't own it any more than anyone else does. It's an international strait, so they don't own the Strait of Hormuz. They don't own the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They don't own a single drop of international water anywhere. If you were going to transit today, either the Panama or the Suez Canal, you would find world-class administration and security that's provided by Panama and Egypt. If you were going to transit the Gibraltar Strait or the Strait of Malacca today, you'd find hundreds of ships that are transiting. They're doing so in an orderly, predictable way, and you would find the nations that border those straits engaged and ready to respond to emergencies. If you transit the Strait of Hormuz today, you're going to be met by and potentially harassed or threatened or seized by vessels from the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy. That makes the Strait of Hormuz unique, and Iran unique as a single bad actor in that part of the world, in my view. So let's take a few minutes to look at some of the recent history of malign maritime behavior. As we heard from the previous speakers, Iran has developed some pretty unique conventional and asymmetric capabilities in order to advance their strategic objectives. They've developed or purchased ballistic missiles that are capable of ranging as far as Eastern Europe, and they're becoming increasingly more precise in their guidance. They have land and sea-based surface-to-surface missiles. They have mines of many types, as we heard. Submarines, possibly equipped now with anti-ship missiles. Hundreds, if not thousands, of coastal defense cruise missiles. Tactical aircraft. Amazing to note that they continue to fly F-4s, F-5s, F-14s, airplanes that have long fallen out of inventories everywhere around the world except Iran. They have air defense radars. They just got the S-300 air defense system and missiles. They have fast attack craft, fast inshore attack craft by the hundreds. The development of drones over the last 5 years has been truly impressive because it's and we saw this in the attack on Abqaiq. They can be used for command and control. They can be used for over-the-horizon targeting. And they can be used for bomb hit assessment. So the drone program is indigenous, it's impressive, and it gives them capabilities that they have lacked. And you heard Farzan talk about the lack of command and control capability. Getting more drones gives them a better opportunity to do that. Farzan's report really covers Iranian actions that date back to the days of the tanker war and the Iran-Iraq war. But in the interest of time here, I'm just going to highlight some of the more recent activity and offer some thoughts about how that supports their strategy. So if you look at what they've done really over the last, let's just say 6 years, they attacked there was an incident between the U.S. Monomoy, which is a Coast Guard ship, was doing a visit, and this is the normal activity for U.S. Ships in the region, on what turned out to be an Iranian intelligence dhow. The intelligence dhow, as the rigid hull inflatable boat approached its vessel, this Iranian vessel, the Iranian vessel trained a weapon at it. One of the Coast Guardsmen fired at the Iranian intelligence dhow, and then they departed and went back to their ship. That was diffused, really, that was the end of the incident. Nobody really wanted to talk about it. There was another intercept later that same day with that same intelligence dhow and a passing of it in a patrol craft, and it was done without incident. Then you get to the spring of 2015, and what occurred early in the spring of 2015 and early May is the IRGC attempted to ship some weapons into Yemen. They were very open about it. They weren't trying to sneak these weapons in. It was it was something that you could see that they were doing. They didn't try to hide it, and they were deterred from actually delivering those weapons. And so what resulted from that was a series of what I would consider to be retribution-style attacks on the part of the Iranians. They harassed the motor vessel Maersk Kensington near the Strait of Hormuz. That was a U.S. flagged vessel. Then they seized the Marshall Islands flagged motor vessel Maersk Tigris. That was ransomed after 9 days. They did have a legal claim against Maersk that was being handled in an international court, and that was the reason they used for seizing that vessel. They attacked a Singapore flagged motor vessel Alpine Eternity that had a collision. It had run into an Iranian oil facility that was being constructed within the Gulf. And then they went for several months without any activity until they seized right before, literally the day before the JCPOA was signed, they seized a U.S. Navy riverine craft, 2 of them, that happened to be in Iranian water off of Farsi Island. So that was a mistake on the part of the U.S. Navy, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it was also, activity that the Iranians were very aggressive about. And one of the things that Farzan alluded to in his remarks was it's difficult to know, or maybe it was Michael that alluded to it, when the IRGC does something, at what level was that activity authorized? So were these riverine craft taken at the behest of the head of the IRGC, or was it done by a local commander? And it's very difficult to discern that. When we look at the recent harassment activity that happened just last month that resulted in the president's tweet, and then ultimately resulted in this notice to mariners that came out last week. There were 11 incidents in a single day. That looks to me, when you assess that, as something that was sanctioned at a very high level within the Iranian government. If you consider the fact that regime survival is the number one concern, I don't think it's too strong a statement to assert that the IRGC that exists in order to ensure regime survival. So if you look now at what has happened in the last 4 years since the new administration came into office, candidate Trump said that we would blow any Iranian ship out of the water if they harassed us. And then, interestingly enough, these unsafe and unprofessional interactions that Michael talked about, in 2015, there were nearly 40 incidents, so a couple a month, 2.5 a month roughly, is what that translates to. And then after the inauguration, they continued until about August of 2017. And then effectively from 2017 until just a few months ago, or until the spring of 2019, the IRGC was relatively well behaved, and there were no unsafe and unprofessional interactions with U.S. warships, and very little with other ships. And then you see increased bad behavior. This is the placing of the limpet mines in 2019, the attack on Abqaiq, a ship seizure in the Strait of Hormuz in 2019, another ship seizure just last month. If you consider the fact that today Iran is under crushing U.S. unilateral sanctions, in some sense that does threaten the regime. So they have very high unemployment, double-digit inflation. They're nearly unable to export any oil. They don't have the ability to improve their oil infrastructure. And now they have to deal with this COVID-19 situation. So there's a lot of pressure on the regime. And one of the traditional ways of responding to that pressure, and I believe this is part of their strategy, is to use their maritime navy to harass shipping in the Gulf, in particular U.S. shipping, because that helps raise tensions and that helps unify the Iranian people and keep their mind off of the problems that they're having internal to the country. So I believe that's how they tend to use it. And I think we can expect to see more IRGC harassment until they get some relief from the maximum pressure campaign. The last piece I'll talk about is the notice to mariners. I don't know that it makes much difference that we have it written down, other than the fact that we're at least on record as saying, stay more than 100 meters away. This unsafe and unprofessional behavior that we have seen from time to time out of the Iranians almost always is a violation of either the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea or the call regs, the rules of the road of one kind or another. So they're already violating the rule, having one more piece of paper written down that says, stay more than 100 meters away. What that notice to mariners doesn't do is it doesn't take the responsibility away from the individual commanders. And in many cases, it's the individual sailor that's at the gun mouth that's going to have to discern whether that behavior is unsafe and unprofessional or whether it's hostile intent. So that opportunity for miscalculation that both of the previous speakers talked about is going to continue. And every time the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Navy conducts an unsafe or unprofessional event like that, they offer an opportunity for miscalculation. So, Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Miller. Mike Connell had signaled to me that he would like to just respond to one of the things you said. I know you have a hard stop at noon. We're going to continue this conversation beyond noon. So what I'd like to do is give Mike the opportunity to just respond to something you said. And then I'd like to lead off with asking Vice Admiral Miller several questions, because I know he's going to have to leave. And then we could have the discussion between Farzin and Mike. So Mike, why don't you jump in with the point you wanted to make? And then I have a few questions for Vice Admiral Miller, and then we'll continue from there.
Sure, it's just a minor point. I just want to clarify. I hope I didn't convey that the Iranians believe that they own the space around the Strait of Hormuz. They don't. Merely, I was trying to make the point that there are different legal interpretations We adhere to UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even though we haven't ratified it. They haven't either ratified it, by the way. But the differing legal interpretations are tied into how you define the Gulf as a body of water and passage of warships through the transit scheme inside the Strait and also inside the Gulf. So my point was merely that there are different legal interpretations, and I think that some of the misunderstanding stems from those divergent interpretations, those legal interpretations. It doesn't mean the Iranians are correct in their interpretation, but it does mean that they have a different interpretation.
Well, I take that point, and I understand it, but I think the point you're getting at, please correct me if I'm wrong, is whether or not you can conduct transit passage or innocent passage through the Strait, and I think there's a pretty good body of legal evidence or legal authority that says you can conduct transit passage, and that's of course important to warships. Because that's what allows you to fly helicopters or to make a submerged transit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm not contesting that. I think there is plenty of evidence. But the Iranian interpretation, at least the one that they say publicly, contests that.
Okay. If I could start off the conversation, if I could ask Vice Admiral Miller 2 or 3 questions, if you don't mind. I'm gonna front load the questions to you, and then we're gonna go on to Farzin and Mike afterwards. But first of all, we've talked about these unsafe and unprofessional interactions involving the IRGC Navy with our forces in the Gulf. Can you tell us from the time you were at NAVCENT and preceding and then since, my understanding is that the Iranians have kind of closed the envelope, that they used to give us more leeway, and that eventually we've gotten to a situation now, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a situation now where they're getting just a few tens of meters from our ships. So is this a situation, what can we do to push back and enlarge the envelope? Are there non-lethal and less than lethal means we can use? Should we be trying to expand that envelope, or does it not really matter? That's the first question. The second was, Mike Connell brought up the whole issue of carriers operating outside the Gulf, and I think last May, when I don't remember if it was the Abraham Lincoln, for most of its deployment, if I got it right, for most of its deployment, it stayed outside the Gulf and then finally made a port call inside the Gulf during the final phase of its deployment, when tensions had been reduced a bit. So I want to ask, do you see a day coming when during periods of tension, we're not going to send carriers into the Gulf, and how does that, shape our ability to operate or influence our ability to operate? And the final question, and again, I apologize for piling it on, but we really want to tap into your knowledge and experience. If we didn't have a legacy Navy, and you were to design a Navy from the waterline up today to deal with the threats that we're dealing with in the Gulf as well as elsewhere in the world, would you still go with a big ship Navy with these, 11 very large carriers, or would you, a lot of people are arguing that we need to build a lot more smaller platforms that will be more survivable, that if they do get hit, it's at a less of a expense in blood and treasure to our force and our ability to operate. So is our force, can we, deal with the threat with our force, or would you redesign the force to deal with threats we're dealing with in the Gulf and elsewhere today? A lot on the plate there. I apologize, but we want to hear from you before you have to leave.
Thanks, Mike. All great questions, which is no surprise. So I'll just take them one at a time here. On the unsafe and unprofessional interactions, there already is in place a whole series of options that are available to commanders that allow the commander to begin to express his concern with a vessel that's closing. And the first thing I'd like to say is the actual distance between the IRGC ship and a U.S. warship is not really the determining factor. It's the posture by which they get to that position. So it's how aggressive they are, because the commanders and as I said in my remarks, if it happens quickly enough, and we had a situation when I was out there off the USNS Roanoke, entering port into Jebel Ali, where the master of the ship never ordered the gun mount to fire, but the gun mount did fire at what turned out to be an Emirati fishing vessel that was closing very rapidly towards it. And fortunately, we had a radar track to prove that. We didn't have cameras because we were just developing that capability. But it looked as if he was going to ram the ship, and so the gun mount, the sailor at the gun mount, fired and hit the ship and killed an Indian fisherman. This was back in 2012 or early 2013. So you can't have that miscalculation occur, but there are warning shots, there's radio calls, there's the long-range acoustic device, there are flares that you can put up depending on how much time you have. There's a whole series of actions that can be taken, sounding of the ship's whistle with the danger signal, that all, given the fullness of time, allow the commander to save actual lethal fire as a last resort. And so what I think we're going to see, as the Iranians continue to harass, is we'll see warning shots. And we've seen that in the past, and that typically serves as a way to get the IRGC to reset and build some of that room back in that you've talked about. But they're aggressive, and I think Mike Connell was the guy that said it, that the IRGC tends to reward aggressive behavior, and I certainly think that that's the case. So, do you have any further questions on that, or does anyone else want to comment?
Yeah, okay, on that point. Yeah, but there were two other questions if I could get you to, but if anybody else had anything on this, that's fine. Okay, if you could go on to the...
Okay, all right. On the operations, where you put the high value units, the carrier in particular, inside the Gulf or outside the Gulf, I spent, without giving away names or classified information, I spent the first half of my tour in a knockdown, drag-out fight with the 4-star I was working for, which is not really that wise, if you're a 3-star, about where we should put the carrier, inside or outside the Gulf, because we each had a strongly held opinion, and one is different. It is fair to say that if you're going to project power, if you're going to fight with Iran, you're going to be able to do so more effectively inside the Gulf, but it's much riskier inside the Gulf. The question you really asked as part of that question was, do we get to a point where the Gulf becomes a no-go zone? And there's a possibility that could happen. This is why the U.S. was so against the S-300 weapon system, because it comes with other capabilities that if they get some additional capability in the surface-to-surface sort of missiles, their ability to target a high-value unit becomes much greater. And then you've got to really start to think about how you would bring a carrier in, or under what circumstances you would do that. That sort of ties into your next question, and certainly you can operate effectively outside the Gulf with a carrier strike group and still be effective in a fight against Iran.
Although I assume our goal would be to operate from the outside in and eventually fight our way into the Gulf, just to get the advantage that the reduced standoff provides in terms of additional range and the like. But I assume, I don't know.
You get the same effect. You get the same effect, but it just takes longer because you're outside. And so what I build, what kind of Navy would I build? This gets to a comment I think you made in your opening remarks, which is there's a lot of talk about the great power competition, and if we're involved in a great power competition, and I do believe we are, and I believe the Chinese believe we are, and I believe the Russians believe that we are to a certain extent, then a carrier-focused, carrier-based Navy is the right way to go, because you need that kind of firepower, and it shouldn't be lost on anybody. The Russians can't replicate that. They just don't have the shipbuilding capacity. They don't have the money. But the Chinese do. and they are. And they're already building a couple more carriers, and they're looking to build nuclear-powered carriers. And I think by the time they get to carrier number 4, it will be a nuclear-powered carrier. So, and I have to admit to everybody, I grew up on aircraft carriers, and I commanded one. So, it's, they throw you out of the club if you say you don't want to build more carriers. And I don't want to get thrown out of the club. But I do believe in aircraft carriers, and I believe we can protect them, and I believe they're a great way to project power. But what would I build in the Gulf? I do believe in more ships and cheaper ships, and some of them are manned and some of them are unmanned, and all of them are fast. You take we have 16 patrol craft in the Gulf between the Navy and the Coast Guard. We have 4 minesweepers. The plan is to replace those with 8 LCS. That's not the right plan. We need to replace those with about 20 or 30 fifth generation, if you will, patrol craft. These are carbon fiber. They're fast. They're hard to find on radar. They're well enough armed. You can put a light unmanned helicopter on them to extend the range and their UAV. And you just build a bunch of them. And that's how you match up with the IRGC, and that's how you match up much better with the Gulf Navies and the Gulf Coast Guards on the GCC side.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate, and I know you're going to cut out in a few minutes, so thank you for, let me just say now, thank you for participating, and it's always great to have you. So let me just go to Farzin and Mike with questions. First of all, Farzin, I have a question from one of our listeners asked that, and Mike, feel free to answer this as well when it comes to you, but when, in the event that sanctions on Iran are lifted, as is supposed to happen this October, we'll see what happens at the UN Security Council. The United States is trying to have the ban on arms transfers to Iran that, according to UN Resolution 2231, have that extended. But if they're not extended, what kind of weapons in the naval arena do you expect Iran to try to acquire? And where will they invest what money they have to obtain the biggest bang for the buck? And then Mike Connell, could you talk a little bit about the tensions between the IRGC Navy and the regular Navy? Is that still extant? Is that still an issue? Or the fact that they have kind of different areas of responsibility, does that kind of reduce the potential for tension? So if I could ask you to start off with those, and then we'll continue with our conversation, that'd be great. Farzin, why don't you go?
Okay. Iran can pursue 2 avenues. One is to seek complete warships from China, for example, or from Russia. Or it can pursue another avenue, seeking help with designing its. I think that they might pursue both, since they have a limited capacity to build their own warships and submarines. They might try to obtain them faster by buying them from China, for example. In 2014, the then commander of the Iranian Navy visited China, and they discussed possible avenues of cooperation. And I can assume that, given their visits to certain Chinese shipyards, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Given their visits to certain Chinese shipyards, I think they might be interested in Chinese Type 52 destroyers or Type 54 frigates, which even Russia is considered buying, or even P-18 export destroyers, sport frigates. And these are very well designed, heavily armed and equipped frigates and destroyers that China will certainly be willing to offer to Iran if there are no sanctions, and Iran can fairly quickly buy several of them to equip their national navy to operate in open seas, and they can also buy some of those sealed catamaran anti-access missile vessels that the Chinese built. Iran might also seek to to buy, for example, air-independent propulsion from China to equip its future submarine designs, AIP, and possibly if Russia has offers their modern export submarines, Iran might be interested in buying some as well. In terms of missiles, Iran designs and develops its own anti-ship missiles, and they have a great range of them available. But China, which has a history of cooperating with Iran in terms of transferring technologies to with regard to anti-ship cruise missiles, and might be willing to help Iran develop its a new generation of cruise missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles. We witnessed in the most recent incident that Iranian anti-ship missiles have a problem of identifying their targets, and it is very dangerous in a highly congested area like the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz to have a missile that has active radar homing at the terminal phase of the flight, and it homes on the largest radar return, and that could very well be a commercial ship or a U.S. warship for that reason, and that makes things much more dangerous in that area. And there have been reports that the missile that was used in that certain test was a new anti-ship missile with a seat-seeking missile, but it still didn't work well. And I can assume that Iran will seek help from China to develop missiles with dual band seekers or data links that could help alleviate such shortcomings.
Thank you, Farzin. Mike? And let me just, forgive me for just interrupt, let me just say to the audience, we're going to be going over a little bit over our time here. Both Mike and Farzin are available to continue the conversation for a bit longer. So we're going to go on for, a few more, another 10 minutes or so maybe. So you're welcome to stay with us. I'm sorry, Mike. I just wanted to.
Yeah, no, it's no problem. So first on the point you just raised, just to add a little bit to what Farzin's been saying, we've been looking a lot at the Russia angle as well. And of course, Iranian military officials have been going back and forth to Russia on a fairly regular basis with shopping lists, preparing for the lifting of sanctions on weapons acquisitions. And some of the systems that I think to look at in the naval realm, there's some high-end systems that I think could really complicate U.S. operations in the Gulf. If, for instance, there's been some press reporting suggesting that the Iranians are interested in acquiring the Yakan. That's the export version of Russia's Bastion anti-ship cruise missile. That's a hypersonic cruise missile. So right now, Iran has sort of middle-grade Chinese anti-ship cruise missiles, which it's modified and produced under a licensed production. But the ones that it could acquire from Russia would be pretty high-end and could be problematic. Could really reduce the reaction times that I was talking about before. Also, there's been some interest expressed in the Type 636 kilo diesel. So this is the new and improved version that Iran's already acquired. The Iranians acquired 3 diesel subs from the Russians, kilos, back in the early 90s, but these would be the upgraded variants of that. And they're air-independent propulsion, very effective, very quiet. So that could also be problematic. And of course, they could also acquire strike fighters, MiG-29s or other aircraft that could be potentially problematic. I think the Iranians are looking to upgrade their Air Force. For people who do look at the Iranian military, of all the services, it really is particularly the regular forces. The Artesh Air Force is probably the least well equipped of all of Iran's forces. They're still flying F-14s, which kind of attests to that. A great aircraft, but they're getting very, very old at this point. So on your second question about the relationship between the two services, the IRGC Navy and the regular Navy, I think it's an excellent question. It gets raised periodically. I think the concept or the idea that's sometimes put out that the two services are almost hostile to each other. That, for instance, in a conflict, there's some way we could carve out the IRGC and separate the forces and sort of get the Artesh out of the fight by convincing him it's not worth it. I don't think there's any credence to that. Everything I've seen, the Artesh Navy has proved that it's loyal to the regime. It's very well penetrated by the Supreme Leader's office. They promote officers based on loyalty to the regime, and I don't think you can split the regular Navy from the IRGC Navy in that regard. I do think, however, there are command and control issues between the two services. Having two naval forces operating quasi-autonomously in the same water space or near the same water space is very problematic. It's hard enough getting to the different services and any military to cooperate with each other, but when they have parallel overlapping functions and missions, it gets even more problematic. The Iranians tried to eliminate this, and they succeeded partially when they divided up the water space in the Gulf, where the IRGC, this was back in the late 2008, 2009, where the water space was divided, and the IRGC Navy took the inside of the Gulf, which it was better suited to working in anyway. The regular Navy assumed responsibility for the area outside the Gulf, Gulf of Oman, Northern Arabian Sea, and Indian Ocean. That alleviated some of the deconfliction issues, but I think those issues will persist. Regular Navy submarines operate inside the Persian Gulf and inside the Strait of Hormuz. IRGC Navy vessels operate outside of the Gulf. There's been a lot of press reporting about their activities down by Yemen and by the Red Sea. So there are issues. The Iranians are working to eliminate these issues. Farzine's report mentions the establishment of the Khatam al-Anbiya headquarters. These are these joint headquarters, regional headquarters. And the two services can deconflict there, but I think they've got a long way to go. And if you're looking for a seam, that's where it is. It's this C2 issue, command and control issue.
Thank you. Let me just actually put out a bunch of questions to both of you, and we'll figure out the deconfliction as you respond. First of all, I just, I don't know, I think it was maybe Farzine or maybe Mike, you also brought up the whole issue of a fleet air arm, so to speak. To what degree, if you look at, I guess, assigned forces, both the IRGC Navy, I don't think the IRGC Navy, they don't have a fleet air arm. They have basically the IRGC Air Force, which is a very small force. I guess Su-25s and Tucanos, and then you got the Iranian Air Force, and then the Iranian Navy doesn't have a fleet air arm. So do we see during exercises the regular Air Force or the IRGC Air Force participating, providing air support? Because of course, we have carriers, and our air arm is a very critical part of our ability for our fleets to operate, both in providing a kind of an aerial umbrella over the fleet as well as a power projection capability. So do we see them kind of exercising the regular Air Force and the IRGC Air Force in support of the Navy during exercises? And then I want to ask you both about the recent accident involving the accidental launch of a missile by, I think it was the Jamaran, which is one of their frigates or corvettes, however you want to classify it, against a support ship that was towing out the target. Is there a problem with the problem with the culture of safety in the regular armed forces that you also see kind of in just the regular society? I mean, you had during Qasem Soleimani's funeral, you had 50 people trampled to death because of poor, crowd control. And around the same day, you had a bus going off the road, killing like 20 people or so. So, and then you see the reaction of the regime to the COVID crisis. So do we see in the Navy also kind of a problem with the culture of safety, or is that, all navies and all military forces have accidents from time to time? So should we not read too much into that? And I'll just note that I read this week in a piece by Alex Fishman on Ynet, an Israeli journalist who follows military affairs, who I don't know if he was being cute or he was speculating or somebody told him something, but he kind of dangled the possibility that this accidental launch of the missile against the ship may have been a cyber inspired event, whether by some foreign power. Okay, So I'll just put that out there and ask you if you have any thoughts about that. I don't have the qualifications to assess that, but both Farzin and Mike, I've put on the table a bunch of questions. So why don't you dig in and maybe we'll wrap it up at that point. So unless either of you have something to say afterwards. So anyhow, Farzin, if you want to take the first bite, and then Mike.
Okay, I will quickly add my comments. Yes, the Iranian Air Force has been developing their existing anti-ship missiles, the C704 and C802, and longer range versions, Nur, Qadir, and Qadir anti-ship missiles under Phantoms, F4 Phantoms, to give them anti-ship role. And since they have Phantoms based on the shores of on the Persian Gulf in Bandar Abbas in Bushehr, they now have this capability to use anti-ship missiles with a range of 35 kilometers up to a range of 100 kilometers plus to target ships. So they have this capability, and they have developed and integrated it, at least some squadrons with this capability. But I'm not sure how often they practice using anti-ship missiles with their Phantom air. The IRGC has a fleet of Su-22, ex-Iraqi Su-22. They overhauled them and brought them back to service. Now there are around 10, 12 in service, one squadron. They plan to bring back to service around 35 Sukhoi Su-22s. I don't know if that will happen, but they recently trialed firing a ballistic missile from one of these Sukhois. It was an interesting development if it did actually work. They just showed photographs of the jettisoning of the missile. Perhaps it was a test flight. We haven't seen any footage of the actual firing of the missile. But if it is actually guided, terminally guided, that would be an interesting development.
If I remember correctly, that was a Fajr rocket that had been modified for delivery, for carriage and delivery by aircraft. Okay.
Yes. It was a Fajr 4. And with regard to culture of safety, and yes, there has been very serious questions about this recent accident, because it happened not very far from the coastline, but still the Navy left them to bleed for 3 to 4 hours, and they were the fishermen, not even the local fishermen, but also fishermen from another province that happened to be around there to find them and to take them to shore. And so it was a major failure by the Navy. If we consider a practice area or live fire practice area, they had to be closed off and they had to be monitored for possible incidents. But however, there has been reports that it was a secret test of a Nur missile with a heat-seeking infrared seeker. So they try to keep it very quiet and secretive because they didn't want the Americans to know about this. So nobody knew about that test. I don't know if that was true or not, but in any case, that was a major failure on the part of the Navy to not to reach the stricken sailors.
Mike?
I don't have much to add. I think Farzin covered all the points very well. I will say there are limited air arms for both the IRIN and IRGCN. The IRIN has rotary wing aircraft, both for reconnaissance, but also I believe the Sikorskys can be fitted with anti-ship cruise missiles, C704s. So there is a limited aircraft capability there too. And I'd also note, I think Admiral Miller brought this up, but the UAV capability definitely bears watching. It's not something that's embedded organically, I believe, in the IRGCN or IRIN. It's the Air Forces of the respective services, but they've used them in a maritime role for reconnaissance, and they certainly have armed UAV capabilities. They've done pretty well. The Shahed 129 is the UAV that a lot of people have been talking about. That has an extensive range. It's estimated it's at least more than 1,000 kilometers. So that's something that bears watching. Safety issue, absolutely, they do have a safety issue. The incident that occurs to me when I think about the regular Navy safety issues is it was referenced before, and I can't remember if it was the Admiral or Farzin who made the point, but the Damavand, when it sunk in the Caspian pier side. So it was a storm, and basically they had pulled one of the frigates into the pier, and it basically, rough weather basically sunk it at the pier. And there's a history of this with the services. They're a little more cavalier, I'd say, than the Western counterparts that spend a lot of time focusing on safety issues. There may be a training component to it as well. Although my impression is that the regular Navy, the training regimen is pretty good, at least by regional standards. IRGC Navy somewhat less so. And finally, your question about the cyber, I don't know what to what to say. That it's quite possible with cyber, but it's I really don't know on that particular point.
Yeah, if I can comment on the cyber aspect, well, it is not technically impossible to deceive an incoming missile, but that source of jamming or deceptive jamming has to be within the range within the cone of the missile guidance system. So that should have come from the general area of the target ship. It cannot be done from Dubai or from Abu Dhabi. That the source of deceptive jamming should be the target ship, and to create a false target away from it. And but if someone wants to infiltrate the network and with information warfare, it requires a network to work on. But I think in this case, that hardly.
Although I wonder, and again, I'm just speculating, that cyber conceivably could have been done from anywhere. You're right, the countermeasures have to be done on site. If you're doing engaged in electronic warfare or jamming or creating a false target, but cyber maybe it's possible. I'll just conclude, because we really need to wrap it up now. But with regard to the safety issue, all I'll have to reference is the imagery that I think the U.S. Navy provided of the Iranian small boat going up to one of those tankers that had the limpet mine, the unexploded limpet mine, and you had a gaggle of guys on a small boat with one of them going and just pulling it off. And I'm saying, that does not conform to any safety procedures that I'm familiar with. Of course, it probably indicated that they were familiar with the functioning of the unit, but nonetheless, even the units that you're familiar with do malfunction when they are being removed from a target. And I said, geez, I don't imagine there's many explosives and ordnance disposal teams around the world who would do it that way. So anyhow, on that note,
it's all a CIA disinformation campaign, Mike. It was all staged.
Okay. Well, listen, I just want to thank both of you for a really informative discussion, and I wish you and all our audience stays healthy. And until next time. So thank you very much. Everybody be well.
Thank you too, Mike.
Thank you.
Take care.